Hello, friends, and welcome back to r/ProRevenge. Today we have a brand new set of great stories for you to enjoy. Sit comfortably. Here we go. I won't give up till you are no longer a landlord. I regretfully got an apartment with what is, in my opinion, the worst landlord ever. This man, I'll call Entitled D or ED, has the audacity to call himself a good person in court. All was well the first few months, then winter hit and the heat went out. It took 3 days to get ED to even answer his phone. By that time, his voicemail was full of complaints from his freezing cold tenants. He told me the law gave him reasonable time to fix it. We spent 2 more weeks with no heat using our stoves and camping in the kitchen in our respective apartments. When ED got his electricity bill, he attempted to raise the rent on the apartments. Obviously, he was not allowed by the city, so he refused to pay his electricity bill, thus denying all of us heat at all. This is where my OCD kicked in, and I went full research mode. I studied every law in regards to federal, state, and city landlord-tenant laws and rights. I found so many violations, it was no longer funny, but scary. I studied building code. I studied the condition of all his apartments. This was easier due to the fact I was either friends with his tenants or had gone there to repair damages caused by frozen pipes and electrical outlets failing due to shoddy wiring and so forth. ED had PO'd all of his tenants. Every last one was PO'd to the point where they wanted to testify against him in court, but couldn't due to the financial hardships the living conditions we were in had been causing. I formulated a plan to get him to repair the buildings he owned. But ED had his own plan. January 2nd at 2 a.m., I was awoken by the smoke detectors in the whole building going off. I quickly ran to the back hall because no smoke was in my apartment, yet I was on the top floor. I opened the door and was greeted by a thick wall of smoke. I quickly ran downstairs after shouting for my girlfriend at the time to get out of the house quick. I pounded on every door and screamed, "Fire!" At this point, the fire department was there and began breaking in doors. I evacuated. After the fire was out and the investigation had started, I witnessed ED give the tenant of that apartment's sister an envelope containing an undisclosed amount of cash, which was visible to anyone nearby. 2 weeks later, the results were released. Arson. The tenant had used hairspray to start the fire and hid the evidence in a hole she punched into the wall. The very person who'd been given money by the landlord. Ironically, she was the only tenant who'd paid rent in the whole building because she had started moving in 2 days prior. I'd not known she was now a tenant, and her sister and kids had moved out the day before. I looked at ED and told him I know what he had done, and I was not going to rest until he lost all his buildings. I then began asking tenants for their stories about their interaction with ED. This is where things got real. He'd been accused of everything from ripping off employees, theft, grand theft auto, bank fraud, and so much more. I formulated a new plan. I sucked up to him and made it known I am a computer tech. ED had a few broken computers and some printer and network issues. I was in. We worked a deal on payment for back rent. I knew he was not good for his word, but it was all part of the plan. Once I got his passwords and logins, I copied his entire HDD to my portable one. I copied all emails in his business account and printed his financial records on my Wi-Fi printer, which was next door. After I fixed his computers and network, I then went home to review my newfound evidence. It was enough, more than enough. I contacted code enforcement with all of the violations of code for every building, including the illegal electrical installation in his new office without permits or even an electrician. He was immediately investigated. That night, I found a 7-day notice to quit on my door. My roommate was worried, but I filled him in on the plan. Remember, I studied all those laws and rights. Well, we get to court, and I open with, "Your Honor, I have proof of a clear violation of the Warranty of Habitability Act." The eviction was thrown out, and he was forced to repair my apartment with me still in it immediately. The next month, I was given another eviction notice. Still, he's losing money due to the fact that I was teaching his tenants landlord-tenant rights and the laws associated with it. Edie kept losing his court dates and kept being told to fix stuff and was continuously fined by the courts and the code enforcement. He was sinking fast. Back to that fire. The woman living there was arrested for arson and charged with 2 counts due to the accidental electrical fire on New Year's Day turned out to be ruled intentional. So the hairspray was in reality attempt 2. He was under investigation for conspiracy to arson and other charges. I wasn't done yet. We went to court again for my non-payment of rent. I won again based on the Landlord Retaliation Act because I'd contacted code enforcement and can prove this blatant retaliation, and the judge didn't even listen to ED. Needless to say, spending the winter without heat took a toll on us tenants. We bought electric heaters and informed the power company that the landlord had shut off all the power to his building and was requiring the tenants to pay for their own power. Well, apparently his illegal wiring caught up to him. He had wired apartments to run off each other, and the common areas were now attached to wiring in every apartment. This put ED in a rough position, as local law says it's the landlord's responsibility to supply power to all common areas. This means his shoddy workmanship and illegal wiring prevents him from legally disconnecting the power. The power company turned on all the power and locked his ability to shut it off until the wiring of common areas was repaired and separated from the apartments. This would cost thousands. Thousands we knew he didn't have. ED was panicking. He kept losing in court, people were legally withholding rent, he couldn't shut off services, and the fines were debilitating. He kept blaming his tenants and refused to repair things. One by one, the buildings were condemned, and ED was required to pay for relocation of his tenants by law. Well, he didn't. He couldn't. He was arrested for attempting to sell 3 buildings the city confiscated from him and for selling one that was condemned. ED got what he deserved. He lost every building he owned, got charged with all kinds of fraud, and was investigated for other crimes I'm still unaware of. But I wasn't done. He caused a lot of suffering. I gave his financial records to the IRS and all the internal memos and everything I got from his computers. Also, I provided the local authorities and code enforcement with the same things. ED was so screwed. I've since gotten a new apartment, and everything he owned has been taken by the city, state, and IRS. I've not seen ED in 3 years, and all of his properties have been bought by someone new, repaired, and have all new tenants who are happy with their new landlords. The old tenants got better places with decent landlords. And what about our wonderful entitled jerk? He's serving multiple sentences for the crimes he committed and is already not getting out anytime soon, yet the investigations are not done and the charges keep coming. ED is somewhere in some prison regretting meeting this tenant. And our next story. How one woman enacts revenge upon a dirty-dealing would-be fraudster. So back in the day, my aunt lived in a council house in a rough area of London. She was caring for her young child, and my uncle was working. They tired of the city life, and this area had a lot of violence, drugs, and the like. She wanted better for her child and family. So she decided to put in for a house swap to Devon, which when you live in a council property, you can do. My family had just moved there, talked about how nice it was and the like, so she filed to swap. Soon she'd found a nice little 2-bedroom flat and was scheduled to swap with a guy, details unknown. Everything went through fine, and they moved to Devon and began a much calmer, safer life. My aunt is a very meticulous person, and so as soon as she knew she was moving, she arranged for all the post to be sent to the new address on the appropriate date. However, there were about 3 days in between where some post was still sent to her old address, and unfortunately this included 2 bank statements, one for my aunt and one for my uncle. Now, any decent person would just throw them out or forward them, send them back to the post office, etc., but not this guy. He proceeded to open that mail, an illegal offense, take the info to the Department of Records, and locate my aunt's mother's maiden name. He then proceeded to attempt to open many credit cards in her and my uncle's name. Fortunately for her, she was notified of this suspicious activity and managed to prevent this fraud from happening, which would have ruined both of their credit and destroyed their chances of getting a mortgage. which they eventually did. My aunt reported this to the police. However, as no crime of fraud had actually been committed, stopped by the banks and my aunt, there were no grounds for criminal charges. Now see, this POS had not been as meticulous as my aunt in redirecting his mail, so the letters began to pile up. My aunt decided tit for tat and opened some of the letters. Turns out this guy was in some pretty serious debt and had been avoiding the debtors, moving being a pretty big way of getting away from them. This guy, before committing his attempted fraud, had asked my aunt not to give out his new address. So my aunt did what anyone would do and called up the debtors one by one, told them that the guy no longer lived at the address. They were obviously disappointed until she gave them the new address, to which they were delighted. Now they knew where he was and began to hound him for the debt he owed, so much so that he lost that lovely council property, which if he'd stayed in, purchased, and then sold, would be worth quite a bit of money since the area has now undergone a lot of investment and growth because he had to skip town and get away from his debtors. If he'd been an upstanding citizen and not a craphead, he probably would have gotten away with it and lived a relatively carefree life. And our last story. I got some payback on an annoying coworker. For a little backstory, I work construction. When work is slow, I deliver pizzas with a company whose name is synonymous with a tabletop game. I knew this coworker from the construction job. When I was very new, he was my lead. He was the kind of guy that would watch you make a mistake, then berate you and call you an idiot for that mistake. Not a nice guy by any right. But one thing he loved to do was brag about how good his wife was, how she was a homemaker, but also bragging about how hot his girlfriend was and how much they sacked when his wife thought he was working overtime. I got a delivery with a familiar name. We'll call him AC. I arrived at the house, knocked, and he opened the door. He looked quite surprised. AC: "Hey, I didn't know you delivered pizzas." Me: "Yeah, when work gets slow. Anyway, that'll be $15. AC: "Here you go." He hands me $16 and kind of looks smug about it. I take the cash and I'm about to turn around and say, just loud enough that anyone inside might hear, "Hey, AC, is this your girlfriend's house or you and your wife's place?" The color drained from his face, and he handed me an extra 20. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.